My name is Renata Caulfield. I'm 38 years old, and the last time I walked into that building, I was 28 years old, carrying 2 suitcases and the specific kind of shame that comes not from doing something wrong, but from being told by the people who raised you that you did. The last time I walked into that building after that, 10 years later, almost to the month, I was carrying a 47-page acquisition brief and the deed to their future. I want to tell you how that happened. I want to tell you all of it, not the clean version, not the version where I knew what I was doing the whole time, the real one, the one where I sat in a parking lot in Nashville at 11 o'clock at night and cried into my steering wheel because my mother had finally, after 10 years, sent me an email that was 37 words long. The one where I built something extraordinary and still, somehow, had to fight the part of myself that just wanted someone in my family to say, "I know you didn't do it. I believe you." That's the story, and it starts a long way before any of that. Before I go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe and like this video. I put everything I have into these stories, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. And drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I always read them, every single one. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Harlan, Kentucky. If you know Harlan, you know exactly what I mean when I say it is the kind of place where your family name is a weather system. You don't just live in it, you live under it. The Caulfield name in Harlan meant the bank, Caulfield Savings and Trust, 3 generations of it. My grandfather built it. My father inherited it. My brothers, Garrett and Miles, were being groomed for it from the time they could sit still in a Sunday suit. And me? I was the youngest, the only girl. I was tolerated at the dinner table and forgotten in the accounting. I know that sounds dramatic. I didn't think it was dramatic at the time. I thought it was just the way things were. I thought I was fine with it. I was 11 years old when I understood that I was not fine with it, and I understood it in the quietest possible way, the way children sometimes understand things that adults think they're hiding. My father had left a handwritten ledger on his desk. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for a pen, but I found it, and I stood there in his study for probably 3 minutes reading columns of numbers, each one labeled with a name. Garrett, Miles, Renata. I didn't need to add anything up to understand what I was looking at. My brother's columns went down the page. Mine barely filled a quarter of it. I put the ledger back exactly where I found it. I went to my room, and I started keeping my own notebooks. Not to be dramatic about it, I wasn't a dramatic kid. I just understood, from that day forward, that if I was going to know what I was worth, I was going to have to be the one doing the accounting. Those notebooks followed me out of Kentucky. They're in a filing cabinet in my Nashville apartment right now. 41 of them. Here's what nobody in my family ever understood about me, and I think it's what made everything that came after both inevitable and unjust. I loved that bank. Genuinely. Not because of the name on the building or what it meant to my father's sense of himself, but because of what it was supposed to be. A community institution. The place where a family in Harlan could get a loan to fix their roof, where a small business owner could sit across a desk from someone who knew their name. I loved the idea of that. I studied accounting and finance at the University of Kentucky, on a scholarship I got myself, supplemented by waitressing and tutoring I never mentioned to my family because I didn't want to hear my father explain why I didn't need to work. I graduated in the top 4% of my class. My father sent a card. He didn't come to the ceremony. Simone Okafor drove 4 hours from Columbus to watch me cross that stage. She was a second-year law student I'd met at a study group the previous fall. We had been friends for 7 months by then. She showed up with a carnation from a gas station and a bottle of decent wine she'd been saving, and she said, "You worked for every single thing they handed you that diploma for. Remember that." I've remembered it every day since. My family's reaction to Simone, to the fact of her, to the friendship, told me everything I needed to know about the values I'd been raised inside. My mother asked once, carefully, whether Simone was from around here. My father never asked about her at all. Garrett, the one time he met her at a family event I'd made the mistake of bringing her to, spent the entire evening talking over her head to someone else. Simone noticed. She didn't say anything about it until we were in the car driving home, and then she just said, "You know you don't have to explain them to me, right?" And I said, "I know." And then I stared out the window for about 40 miles, thinking about everything I'd been excusing my whole life. I took the job at the bank because I genuinely believed it was a door opening. I was 28. I had 4 years of solid professional experience at a firm in Lexington and a compliance certification that had taken me 18 months to earn. My father offered me a junior compliance position, and I absolutely knew, that it was not meant to lead anywhere. I took it anyway. Because I still believed that if I did the work well enough, visibly enough, the door would open wider. For 8 months, I did everything right. I documented everything. I learned the institution from the inside out. I found irregularities in places no one had thought to look, not because I was trying to make trouble, but because finding irregularities was my job, and I was good at it. And then I found Garrett's loan portfolio. It took me 3 weeks to be certain of what I was seeing. A pattern of approvals flowing to a development company called Meridian Sable LLC, a company that Garrett held a personal interest in and had not disclosed on a single regulatory filing. The amounts were not enormous. The regulatory exposure was. I sat with it for 3 weeks because I wanted to be sure. I wanted to be absolutely, unimpeachably sure. If you've ever worked in a place where you knew the right thing to do would cost you something, and you did it anyway, I think you understand exactly where I was standing. If you've ever been the person who told the truth in a room full of people who needed it not to be true, you already know what came next. I reported it through the bank's internal compliance channel, properly, by the book. I documented everything in triplicate, and I kept a copy of all of it, every page, in the filing cabinet under my desk. That Thursday afternoon, I genuinely believed I had just protected the institution I loved. By the following Wednesday, I understood that I had just handed my brother the reason he needed to destroy me. And here is what I want you to sit with for a second. Because this is the part that still, after 10 years, when I let myself think about it clearly, makes something clench in my chest that I don't have a precise name for. It wasn't just Garrett. Garrett fabricated evidence, real documents, falsified in my name, that made it look like I was the one with unauthorized transactions and altered records. That part is monstrous, and it is also, in some terrible way, comprehensible. He was protecting himself. People do terrible things to protect themselves. What I cannot make comprehensible, what I could not make comprehensible then, and cannot fully make comprehensible now, is my father. Douglas Caulfield, who built his entire identity on the idea that he ran a sound, honest institution, who sat across that desk from me and told me that documentation showed I had falsified records. Who looked at me, his 28-year-old daughter, and chose, actively chose, to proceed as though the evidence was real. He knew. I watched him know it. And he chose the name on the building over the person sitting in front of him. If you have ever been in a room where someone who loves you, or is supposed to love you, decided that something else mattered more, you know that it is not anger you feel first. It is a kind of cold, clarifying silence. Like everything that was blurry before suddenly snaps into focus, and you realize you were the only one who didn't see it clearly. If this is already hitting somewhere real for you, if any part of this sounds like a room you've been in, hit like, subscribe so you stay with me through the rest of this, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone in that room. Because what comes next took me 10 years, and I want you to know it was worth every one of them. I had 24 hours to resign and leave. I took 18. I packed 2 suitcases, drove to the office at 6 in the morning before anyone arrived, and I took every page of my internal compliance report from the filing cabinet under my desk. I put them in a cardboard box. I put the box in my car. I drove south on 119 toward Tennessee, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. Not because I was brave, because I didn't trust myself to keep driving if I did. I was 38 years old when I walked back in. But first, I had to become the kind of person who could. The thing about being accused of something you didn't do is that the accusation doesn't stay in the room where it was made. It travels. It gets into phone calls and dinner conversations, and the particular kind of whisper that spreads through a small town like water through cracked concrete. Quietly, completely, and in every direction at once. I found out what was being said about me the way I found out most things in those first months, through a woman named Darlene Purcell, who had worked as a teller at Caulfield Savings and Trust for 19 years, and who called me on a Tuesday evening about 6 weeks after I left. She didn't ask how I was. She just said, "I want you to know what they're saying because I think you deserve to hear it from someone who doesn't believe it." What they were saying was that I had been embezzling, that I had been falsifying loan documents for at least 2 years, that I had been caught, and that my father had shown mercy by not referring the matter to federal prosecutors. That was the version, clean, complete, and delivered with the particular authority of a family that had been the weather system in that town for 3 generations. What Darlene said at the end of the call was, "I've worked for your father for 19 years, and I know what that compliance report of yours would have found. I just want you to know that I know." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat on the floor of my apartment in Nashville, a studio I was renting month to month because I hadn't been able to make myself sign a year lease yet, because some part of me was still waiting to understand what came next. And I sat there for a while with my back against the couch and my knees pulled up, and I thought about what it meant to have your own family construct a version of you and then release it into the world. The version of me that existed in Harlan was a thief. The version that existed in Nashville was 28 years old, had $11,000 in savings, and was eating grocery store rotisserie chicken because it was $4.50 and she could make it last 3 days. I want to be clear about something because I've noticed that when women tell stories like this, there is an expectation that they will describe a period of falling apart, a breaking point, a rock bottom. And I understand why. It makes a satisfying shape, but that isn't what happened to me. What happened was, I got up off the floor. I made a list. Left column, what I can control. Right column, what I can't. I crossed out the right column, and I went to work. I got a contract accounting position at a mid-sized firm in Nashville that didn't know my name and didn't care about Harlan. I worked 70 hours a week for 8 months and saved every dollar I didn't spend on rent and food. I studied for my CPA exam in the evenings at the kitchen table of that studio apartment with a lamp I'd bought at a yard sale for $2 because the overhead light was too harsh. I passed on my first attempt. Simone drove down from Columbus the weekend I got my results. She brought actual champagne this time, not from a gas station, and we sat on the tiny concrete slab outside my apartment that the landlord generously called a patio, and she said, "Okay, what's the plan?" And I told her. Not all of it. I didn't have all of it yet. But I told her the shape of it. I told her I wanted to build something that could eventually come back for what had been done to me. Not revenge, something more permanent than revenge. Something that couldn't be argued with. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "That's going to take a while." "I know," I said. "Okay," she said, and she refilled my glass. Here is what I want you to understand about Simone Okafor. She did not manage me. She did not soften things for me or tell me I was being too hard on myself or too ambitious or too angry. She told me the truth, always. And she asked me the questions I was avoiding, always. And she showed up, always. For 8 of the 10 years since I left Harlan, she showed up so consistently that I sometimes forgot to be grateful for it because it had become as reliable as gravity. You don't think about gravity until you need it. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you keep listening. Because this is the part of the story where I need you to understand the full weight of what was happening. not just to me, but inside me. Garrett knew that what he'd built into that fabricated record would follow me. He knew that the kind of accusation attached to my name would make it harder to get hired, harder to be trusted, harder to build. He had factored that in. That is not a person who panicked and made a bad decision. That is a person who made a calculated one, and he made it with my life. Has someone ever done something to you that was too deliberate to be forgiven quickly, where you could see the thought that went into it, and that was somehow worse than the thing itself? I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what that was like. I read every single one. Because I thought about that calculation every day for a long time, and what I decided, not quickly, not easily, was that the best thing I could do with that knowledge was use it as information rather than injury. Garrett had underestimated me. He had counted on me staying gone. The moment I understood that he had made a bet against me, I understood exactly what winning looked like. By the time I was 32, I had incorporated my first LLC, a small acquisitions vehicle. Nothing dramatic, just a structure that could hold investments and move money in the way I was planning to move it. I named it Caulfield Meridian Holdings. The Caulfield was for me. The Meridian was for Meridian Sable, Garrett's undisclosed company, the one that started all of this. I put both names together in the same entity, and I set it on a shelf, and I let it wait. Simone set up her firm in Nashville 2 years after that, and I became her first major client. We worked together the way people work together when they trust each other completely, without a lot of words, with a great deal of precision, each of us knowing what the other was going to need before it was asked for. And I watched. I watched the bank's regulatory filings every quarter. I tracked the deposit trends. I read the local Kentucky press, Harlan, Middlesboro, Corbin, the way some people read the news of a country they used to live in. I watched the commercial real estate venture Garrett had pushed through in 2019 begin to go sideways. I watched the impairment hit the balance sheet. I watched the board start to fracture. I did not feel happy about any of it. I want to be honest about that. The bank employing 63 people, most of whom had nothing to do with what happened to me, that wasn't something I could feel good about watching deteriorate. That was always the complicating thing. The institution and the family were not the same thing, even though my family had spent 3 generations pretending they were. And then one morning, I opened my laptop and there was an email in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it. The subject line was blank. The sender name was listed as P. Harlan, which made no sense as a name, but made complete and immediate sense as something else. My mother's first initial and the town she had never left. I sat with that email unopened for 4 hours. I made coffee. I went for a walk along the river. I came back. I sat down. I opened it. 37 words. I counted them. Renata, I know you have no reason to read this. I know you have no reason to respond. I have been trying to write this for 8 years, and this is the 14th time I have started, and the first time I have finished. I know what happened was not what they said. I have always known. I am very sorry. I don't expect that to be enough. I wanted you to have it anyway. Mom. I read it 4 times. The 4th time, I noticed something I hadn't noticed the first 3 times, which was that my hands were not entirely steady. I closed my laptop. I put on my coat. It was October, and the air along the river had that particular cold in it that smells like the end of something. I walked 3 miles without thinking about where I was going. When I turned around and walked back, I was thinking about one specific sentence. Not the apology. I had imagined versions of that sentence for 10 years. Not the part about not expecting it to be enough. The part I kept returning to was this. I have been trying to write this for 8 years. 8 years. Which meant that somewhere inside the first 2 years after I left, while I was on that studio apartment floor, while I was eating $4 rotisserie chicken, while I was passing my CPA exam under a $2 yard sale lamp, my mother had already known. She had sat with knowing it. She had tried to write something and stopped. 13 times she had stopped. I didn't know whether that made it better or worse. I still don't completely. What I knew, standing on the Riverwalk in Nashville in October with cold air in my lungs, was that something had shifted. Not broken open, shifted. Like a piece of furniture that has been in one place so long you've stopped seeing it, and then someone moves it 2 inches and suddenly the whole room looks different. The acquisition offer had been in preparation for 14 months. The board vote was 3 weeks away. I had been thinking of it as a business transaction, the most personal business transaction of my life, but a transaction, a closing. My mother's 37 words changed the shape of what I was walking toward. It was no longer just a closing. It was something that needed to be entered differently. I just didn't know yet exactly how. I went back to the office and I called Simone. She reached out, I said. A pause, then, quietly, how? Email. She said she knows I didn't do it. Another pause, longer. Renata. I know. What do you want to do? I looked out my office window at the Nashville skyline going dark in the early evening. I'll figure it out after the vote, I said. Right now, I need to focus. Simone didn't push. She never pushed. She just said, okay, and we went back to work. But I thought about that email all night. I thought about a woman sitting down to write the same letter 14 times over 8 years and not finishing until the 14th. I thought about what kind of courage that takes, or maybe what kind of exhaustion. I thought about how strange it is that the people who hurt us most are sometimes not the ones who acted, but the ones who watched and said nothing. And I thought about how I was going to walk into that bank building in 3 weeks and what I needed to feel when I did. 3 days after my mother's email, Garrett called me. I didn't have his number saved. I had deleted every contact from my family the week I arrived in Nashville. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. The way you remove a splinter not because you hate your finger, but because leaving it in causes damage. But I knew his voice in the first syllable. 10 years of silence and 1 syllable, and I was 28 years old again, standing in my father's office looking at the clock. I let him finish his first sentence. He said I needed to withdraw the acquisition offer, that the family was not interested, that the board would vote the way my father instructed. I said, the board hasn't voted yet, Garrett. He said, withdraw the offer. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that. Not because I'm proud of my composure, but because I need you to understand what 10 years of preparation feels like in a moment like that. It feels like stillness, complete, expensive stillness. I told him about the deposit numbers, the impairment, the competing offer that would close 3 branches and eliminate 60% of his staff. I told him the facts of his own institution's condition in the same tone I would use to read a weather report. And then I told him about the collateral positions. 14 months earlier, through a series of carefully structured secondary market purchases, Caulfield Meridian Holdings had acquired collateral positions on 2 of the bank's largest outstanding commercial loans. Positions that were technically callable under existing terms if the bank failed certain performance covenants it had failed for 2 consecutive quarters. I had never intended to call them. I am telling you that clearly because I need you to understand the difference between having a weapon and using one. I had them because in any negotiation, you need to know where the floor is, but I had no intention of collapsing the institution over a personal grievance. Those 63 employees were real people with real families. That was never on the table. But Garrett didn't know that. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then he said, "You don't belong here. You never did." "You might be right about that," I said, "but I own the debt on 2 of your collateral positions. So I actually belong exactly where I say I belong." He hung up. I sat at my desk for about 45 seconds. Then I opened a new document and started a list. Left column, What I can control. I filled it in. I did not write a right column. I had learned somewhere in the last 10 years that some things you just let exist without giving them a column. The cease and desist letter arrived 3 days later. Certified mail, delivered to the firm's address, from the outside legal counsel representing Caulfield Savings and Trust. It alleged tortious interference. It requested I cease contact with board members pending independent legal review. It was 4 pages long, and it was, from a legal standpoint, almost entirely without merit. Simone read it standing up, which is what she does when she is assessing something quickly. She set it face down on the conference table. "They're stalling," she said. "Yes. They don't have the footing to stop this." "No. So this is about pressure." "It was always about pressure," I said. "That's the only tool they've ever had." Simone looked at me for a moment, the particular way she looks at me when she is deciding whether to say the harder thing. She said it. "Are you okay?" I thought about that. "I think I will be," I said, "after Friday." She nodded once. She picked up the letter and walked back to her office. That was the end of the conversation, which was exactly the right amount of conversation to have about it. That evening I did something I had not planned to do for another 3 weeks. I called the number my mother had sent the email from. It rang 5 times. I had almost decided it was a library phone, a borrowed phone, something impermanent. And then she answered. Her voice was exactly the same. That was the thing I was not prepared for. I had built up 10 years of distance, and her voice collapsed it in about half a second. It was still her, still exactly her. "I got your email," I said. A silence, long enough that I heard her breath change. Then, "I didn't know if you would call." I didn't know if I would either. What followed was 22 minutes that I am not going to reconstruct completely, because some things belong only to the people who were in them. What I will tell you is that my mother said she was sorry in 6 different ways across those 22 minutes, and I listened to every version, and I did not tell her it was enough because it wasn't, and I did not tell her it was nothing because it wasn't that either. What I will tell you is that at some point she said, "I stood in the hallway, outside your father's study. I heard everything." I already knew this somehow. I think I had always known it. "I know," I said. "I want to explain." "Mom," I said it quietly. "Not tonight, okay? Not tonight." She said okay. We stayed on the line for another few minutes, not saying very much. And then we said goodbye, and I sat in my car in the parking garage under my building, and I cried. Not the way you cry when something breaks, but the way you cry when something that has been frozen for a very long time begins, at the edges, to thaw. It is not comfortable. It is not relief. It is just the sound your body makes when it starts to believe that it might be safe to feel something. I let it happen. Then I drove back to the office and worked until midnight. The board meeting was held on a Friday morning in the main conference room of Caulfield Savings and Trust in Harlan, Kentucky. Simone and I drove up together the night before and stayed at a motel in Middlesboro because neither of us wanted to be in Harlan any earlier than necessary. We ate dinner at a diner off the highway, eggs and coffee and bad pie, which Simone ate with the focused appreciation of someone who considers bad diner pie a genuine pleasure. And we went over the presentation one final time. "You know this material cold," Simone said. "I know. So tomorrow isn't about the material." "No," I said. "What is it about?" I thought about that. "Walking in," I said finally. "Everything after that I can handle. It's just the walking in." Simone looked at me across the table. She had driven 4 hours to watch me cross a stage with a carnation from a gas station. She had sat on a concrete patio slab in October and asked me what the plan was. She had spent 8 years building a legal infrastructure around a vision I had described to her in an almost empty Nashville apartment. She said, "You've been walking toward that door for 10 years. Tomorrow, you just finish the walk." I looked at my bad pie. "Yeah," I said. "That's right." We drove into Harlan the next morning at 8:45. I watched the town come up through the windshield the way you watch a place you grew up in when you've been gone long enough to see it clearly. Smaller than memory, more itself than you expected. The hill coming down into town, the courthouse, the particular gray of October sky over southeastern Kentucky that I had not seen in 10 years and recognized immediately. The way you recognize the smell of a house you used to live in. And then the bank building. 4 stories of brick on Main Street, the Caulfield name still in gold letters above the entrance. The same carpet inside that I knew without seeing it. The same smell. I sat in the car for about 30 seconds after Simone parked. She didn't say anything, she just waited. "Okay," I said. We went in. Douglas was already in the conference room, so was Garrett. Garrett looked at me the way you look at something you hoped wouldn't show up, and then immediately looked at his phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how prepared he was for this. Douglas looked at me directly, and I saw something in his face that I had to work to identify because I had never seen it there before. It was beneath the composure, beneath the authority, beneath the carefully maintained surface of a man who had run an institution for 30 years. It was the arithmetic of regret, not performed, not offered to me, just present, the way an old injury is present. You don't always feel it, but you always know it's there. I set my materials on the conference table. Simone sat to my left. I began. 31 minutes. I had timed the presentation 17 times. I talked about the employees by name where I could, the loan officers, the branch managers, people whose careers had been built inside this institution and who deserved to know someone was accounting for them. I talked about the community, the small businesses, the families, the specific economic function a community bank serves in a place like Harlan that a regional roll-up simply cannot replicate. I put numbers on the table that were honest and clear and left no reasonable person with a reasonable question about which offer served the institution better. When I finished, Douglas said, "I'd like to speak with you, alone." The board filed out. Garrett stood. "Dad," he started. "Outside, Garrett." Something crossed Garrett's face. Not anger, something more complicated and less comfortable than anger. He looked at me once, briefly, and in that look I saw the things Simone had told me I would eventually see if I was patient enough. I saw that he was afraid. Not of me specifically, of the specific weight of 10 years of a decision he had made and could not unmake. He left. The door closed. Douglas and I looked at each other across the conference table. Outside the window, Harlan was going about its October morning. A truck moved along Main Street. Somewhere a door opened and closed. "You built this," he said, not a question. "Yes. All of it. On your own. With good people, but yes." He was quiet. His hands were flat on the table and they were not entirely steady, which was the first time in my life I had ever seen my father's hands be anything other than still. "I want to tell you," he started. "You don't have to," I said, and I meant it, not as mercy, as fact. I had stopped needing him to say it somewhere around year 7. What I needed had stopped being something he could give me. "Then what are you here for?" I looked at him steadily, across the table, across 10 years. "I'm here to save the bank," I said. "The same thing I've always been here for." He stood slowly, he moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, and he did not turn around when he said it. I should have looked more carefully at the documentation. 10 years ago. I should have looked more carefully. And here is the thing I need you to understand about that moment, because this is the part that I think about most, even now, even more than the board vote, even more than the acquisition closing. It was not an apology. It was the closest he was capable of coming to one. And I understood, in that moment, that this was the entire sum of what he had, that this was everything, that some people's emotional vocabulary simply does not contain the words that would make a thing right, and you can spend your whole life waiting for them to learn the language, or you can accept that the sentence they gave you is the only sentence they have. If that hit you somewhere, if you know what it is to wait for a version of an apology that the other person simply does not have the capacity to give, hit that like button. Subscribe so you stay with me. Because what I felt in that room, sitting alone after my father walked out, is the part of this story I most want you to hear. He left. The door clicked shut. I sat alone in the conference room of Caulfield Savings and Trust for 4 minutes. I took out a notepad. I wrote 2 columns, and then, for the first time in my life, I looked at the right column, the one I always crossed out, and I didn't cross it out. I just looked at it. I let all of it exist in the right column without needing to eliminate it. My father's incomplete sentence, my mother's 37 words, Garrett's fear in the doorway, the carpet that was the same carpet. I let it all sit there, uncrossed. Then I put the pen down. The board voted 6-3 in favor of the acquisition. The acquisition closed on a Thursday in November, 37 days after the board vote, in the conference room of Okafor Mercier LLP in Nashville. 4 hours of paperwork, signatures on documents that had taken 14 months to prepare and 10 years to make possible. Simone's paralegal brought in a fresh stack every 20 minutes, and I signed each one with the same pen. A cheap ballpoint I'd had since my CPA exam, the kind that costs less than $1. The kind I have always preferred because it doesn't leak, and it doesn't run out, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do, without making a statement about it. When the last document was signed and witnessed, and the paralegal had taken the final stack away, Simone ordered Thai food, pad see ew and spring rolls, and a curry that was slightly too spicy for both of us, and that we ate anyway. We sat at the conference table, surrounded by the organized aftermath of 14 months of work. Folders, binders, flagged documents, and color-coded stacks. And we ate takeout Thai food in the middle of it, like 2 people who had been too busy to notice they were hungry. At some point, Simone set down her fork and looked at me. "How do you feel?" she said. I thought about it. An actual moment. Not a polished one, not the answer I would give in public. I let the question sit for a few seconds, and I tried to find the honest answer underneath all the other answers. "Like I finished something," I said. "Not like I won something, like I finished it." "Is that what you wanted?" I picked up a spring roll. "I think it's better than what I wanted," I said. "What I wanted for a long time was for them to understand what they did. And I don't think that's going to happen. Not completely, but I finished it, and that's mine regardless of whether they understand it." Simone nodded slowly. She picked her fork back up. "That took you a while to get to," she said. "About 9 years," I said. She smiled. "I'll take it." The rebranding took 6 weeks. I kept all 63 employees. Every branch stayed open. I brought in a new operations director, a woman named Carla Dupree from Louisville, who had spent 15 years turning around undercapitalized community banks, and who walked into the Harlan branch on her first day and immediately started learning every employee's name. By the end of her first week, she knew all of them, including the part-time Saturday teller who had been there for 4 months and who told me later that she'd never worked somewhere where management knew her name that fast. I rebranded the institution as Meridian Community Bank. I kept the community reference because it was the truest thing about what the bank was supposed to be. I dropped the family name because it wasn't my family's institution anymore. It was the community's, the way it should have always been understood. The formal notification of rebranding went to all stakeholders by certified mail. My father received his copy at the same Harlan address he had lived at for 40 years. I know because the delivery confirmation came back signed in his handwriting, which I recognize the way you recognize handwriting you grew up seeing on birthday cards, even the ones that arrived without the person who was supposed to come with them. I don't know what he did with the notification. I didn't need to. Garrett resigned from the executive team 9 days after the acquisition closed. He submitted a formal letter of resignation to the new board, which I chaired, citing a desire to pursue other professional opportunities. It was 4 sentences long. I accepted it the same day it arrived, without comment, without condition, without a counteroffer. I signed the acceptance with the same cheap ballpoint. What happened to Garrett after that came to me the way most things about my family came to me, through Darlene Purcell, who had retired from the bank but who still knew everything and everyone and who called me every few months to talk. Darlene told me that Garrett's personal financial situation deteriorated faster than anyone expected after he left. The house he had been carrying a mortgage on that was too large for his salary turned out to be impossible to sustain on severance and scrambled consulting work. His wife found out, in the process of the financial unwinding, what the real story was. Not from me, from documents, financial disclosures, old board minutes, the paper trail that had been sitting inside the institution all along, and that became accessible in ways it hadn't been before. She found out in the way spouses sometimes find out about the worst things, not from the person who did them, but from the evidence they left behind. I did not feel good about this. I want to be clear about that. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was the particular exhausted sadness of watching someone arrive at a consequence they chose, without knowing they were choosing it, a decade before. What I felt was that Garrett had made a bet that his life could be insulated from the truth forever, and the truth had simply waited him out. The truth is patient in a way that people never expect. Darlene said to me on one of those calls, "Do you want to know how he's doing?" And I thought about it for a moment, really thought about it. And I said, "No, I don't think that's mine to carry." And Darlene said, "That's probably right." And we moved on to talking about the new branch manager I'd hired in Corbin, and whether the coffee in the break room had improved, which Darlene considered a matter of serious institutional importance. The public narrative in Harlan shifted the way public narratives shift in small towns. Not all at once, not with any single announcement, but gradually, through the accumulation of visible facts. People saw that the branches stayed open. They saw that the employees kept their jobs. They saw the Meridian Community Bank sign go up where the Caulfield sign had been. And they understood, without anyone having to explain it to them, that the daughter who had been quietly erased from the family story 10 years ago had come back and done something the family itself had failed to do. Nobody called to congratulate me. I hadn't expected anyone to, but Darlene told me that one of the longtime customers, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been banking at that branch for 31 years, and who Darlene described as the most stubborn man in Harlan County, had walked in the first week after the rebrand and asked the teller who owned the place now. When the teller told him, Gerald Fitch apparently stood there for a moment and then said, "Good, that family always underestimated that girl." And then he deposited a check and left. I think about Gerald Fitch sometimes. I've never met him. I hope his roof is holding up. My mother came back in the way my mother was capable of coming back. Carefully, slowly, in small increments, as though she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to. She called twice more before we agreed to meet. Each call was a little longer than the one before. In the third call, she mentioned the box. "There's a box," she said, "in the back of my closet. I wrote you letters over the years. I never sent them." I was quiet for a moment. "How many?" I said. 43, she said, and then, very quietly, "I kept starting and I kept not being able to finish." I thought about a woman sitting at a kitchen table in the early morning before my father woke up, writing a letter she would not send, writing it and stopping, writing it again, 43 times over 10 years. I thought about what it cost a person to carry that much unsent honesty. I thought about my own notebooks, 41 of them, kept since I was 11, recording everything I did and everything I was worth. We were, in our different ways, both people who had been keeping records. We had just been keeping them for different reasons. I met her at a diner in London, Kentucky, halfway between Harlan and Nashville, a place where neither of us was known. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back booth with her hands folded on the table and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked smaller than I remembered. She had always been slim, but there was something about the way she was sitting, upright but careful, like someone who had prepared for something and was trying to hold the preparation together, that made her seem like she was taking up the least amount of space she possibly could. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw it, the thing I had forgotten, or maybe the thing I had been trying to forget. Her eyes. The same gray-green as mine, the same shift in the light. I had my father's build and my father's stillness, but I had my mother's eyes, and seeing them across a diner in London, Kentucky cost me something I wasn't prepared for. Something cracked open very quietly, without drama, without a name. I walked across the diner and I sat down. We talked for 2 hours. I'm not going to give you a scene where she says exactly the right thing and I forgive her completely, and we walk out into the autumn sunlight as a healed family unit. That's not what happened. What happened was more complicated and more real than that. She said she was sorry, and I believed her. She said she had been afraid of my father for 40 years, and I believed that too. She said she knew she had no right to ask for anything, and I told her she was right, she didn't, and that I was here anyway, which was the most honest thing I knew how to give her. She told me something near the end of those 2 hours that I haven't shared with anyone except Simone. She said that after I left, in the first weeks, she had gone into my father's study and found the fabricated documentation. The records Garrett had constructed. She had seen, in the paper trail, the evidence of what her son had done. She had known with certainty from that point forward. "Why didn't you?" I started. "I know," she said. "I know." And there was nothing else to say about it right then. There may never be enough to say about it. Some silences have a shape that words can't fill completely, and the only honest thing you can do with them is acknowledge the shape and decide what you want to build around it. I drove home to Nashville with the windows down despite the cold. 43 degrees, and I kept them down the whole way, because I needed the air, and I needed to feel it, and I needed the particular clarity that comes from physical cold, when you are trying to think through something that doesn't resolve cleanly. About a week after that, I wrote a letter, a real one, on paper, which I had not done in years. I addressed it to my father. I did not send it through the bank. I sent it to the house, the same Harlan address, the one where the rebranding notification had been delivered and signed for in his handwriting. The letter was not long. It was not angry. I told him that I was not writing to ask for anything, and I was not writing to relitigate the past. I told him that I had the compliance report, the original one, the one I copied the night before I left, and that I had always had it, that I had never needed to use it because I had decided that the best proof of what I was worth would be the record I built for myself, not the record I defended against. And then I wrote the sentence that had been forming in my mind since I sat alone in that conference room with the uncrossed right column in front of me. I wrote, "I built what I built because I knew what was true about me, even when you chose not to. That knowledge was always mine. It was never yours to take, and it was never yours to give back." I told Simone about the letter. I read her that sentence. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's who you are now." Just that. 4 words. I folded the letter. I put it in an envelope. I sent it. My father has not responded. I did not expect him to. The letter was not written to receive a response. It was written to complete a thought I had started when I was 28 years old, standing in his office, looking at the clock. The thought is complete now. My name is Renata Caulfield. I'm 38 years old, and on an ordinary Wednesday morning in December, I made coffee in my apartment in East Nashville and stood at my kitchen window watching the light come up over the roofline of the building across the street. The coffee was good. The light was the specific pale gold that December mornings sometimes produce in Tennessee when the sky is clear and the air is cold and everything is very still. I thought about a girl in a study in Harlan, Kentucky, finding a ledger and putting it back exactly where she found it, and going to her room and starting to count. I thought about 41 notebooks and a filing cabinet. I thought about a carnation from a gas station, and a $2 yard sale lamp, and a concrete slab patio in October, and bad diner pie, and 4 hours of closing documents, and a cheap ballpoint pen. I thought, some things you document for yourself, not for proof, just so you know. I held my coffee with both hands, and I watched the light change, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, maybe for the first time period, like I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because anything outside of me had confirmed it, just because I knew it, the way I had always known it, the way nobody had ever been able to take from me, not even when they tried their hardest. The light came up. I finished my coffee. I went to work. Before you go, I want to ask you something real, something I've been thinking about since I started putting this story into words. We talk a lot about forgiveness like it's a door you either walk through or you don't. But I think the more honest question is this: what do you do when the person who hurt you most is incapable of giving you what healing actually requires? When the apology you needed doesn't exist in a form they can offer? Have you ever had to build your own closure from scratch, without their participation, without their acknowledgement, without the ending you deserved? Leave it in the comments. Tell me how you did it, or tell me that you're still figuring it out. Both answers are the right answer. I read every single comment, and I mean that. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of Renata's walk back through that door felt like something you've carried too, please like this video, subscribe so you're here for the next one, and share it with someone who is in the middle of their own 10 years. Someone who needs to hear that what they know about themselves is not anyone else's to take, not anyone else's to give back. I'll see you in the next one.